law on policy issues, including speech, privacy, surveillance. That stuff is right up my son's alley, by the way. And earned his PhD, cum laude, and master's at University of Michigan. Deborah Fisher, I've known a long time. And since 2013, she has served as the executive director of the Tennessee Coalition of Open Government, which is an absolutely fascinating and really fabulous organization. She also serves as a director of MTSU's John Siegenthaler Chair of Excellence and First Amendment Studies. And before all that, she's been, for 25 years, she was a reporter and editor. And she can, if it pops up some of her area of expertise, she'll bring it in to the conversation. A lot of the press and environmental organizations are really ones that are very familiar with access to records and open government. Jim, our COO and vice president, before he came to us, he has, good Lord, 35 or 40 years in environmental law, environmental engineering, and management firms, very specialized in transactions such as insured brownfields and hazardous waste site remediation. The really easy stuff. Some of the most complex areas of environmental law. And we're thrilled that Jim's now working with us, and he's pulled this together, and I'm going to hand it over to him to sort of get the discussion rolling. And as I said, chat anytime if anybody has any trouble or wants to get a question out there, and unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Dory. Appreciate it. And I want to give a particular shout out to Angela for managing all the technology here. It wouldn't have come off without her great assistance here. And I also obviously want to thank Deborah and Gautam for participating in tonight's panel. What I'd like to do before we start discussing particular topics is kind of set the stage for what's been going on, and hopefully that will give some perspective to all of this. You know, there's this old English curse actually about living in interesting times, and that certainly applies to where we've been in the past year or so, with the past 6 months even, between the COVID-19 pandemic and now the civil protests over rights issues that we have been dealing with. The pandemic, obviously, we're now something like 2.3 million cases in the U.S. and had 123,000 deaths, and that's also raised some very interesting issues of how we participate in governmental decision making. The same measures that help us slow the spread of the disease, avoiding large gatherings and social distancing, have severely curtailed the traditional methods that we've used to participate in governmental decision making, and also ways to, attempts to really supplant those traditional methods. But the death of George Floyd has raised a lot of similar concerns over the spread of disease in public gatherings, and these are the largest public protests that we've seen in 50 years, and they've also created this huge juxtaposition. They've demonstrated how important it is to have these access to these traditional public participation tools. They get results. But of course, they raise concerns about these very same social distancing and pandemic prevention measures that we just talked about. And these issues are developing, and basically daily. The facts change daily. Just today, Governor Lee announced that he wouldn't extend beyond June 30th his order allowing for electronic meetings. But you have people like the Wilson County mayor who declared a state of emergency and now requires everyone to wear a mask when in public. And even the administrative agencies such as TDEC, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, now seems to be allowing meetings, electronic methods to supplement traditional meetings as opposed to having internet-only meetings. So, all this is really to say that, what we've seen in the past couple of months, is really a highlighting of a lot of the unfair shifting of burdens, of our industrial society onto communities of color and the disadvantaged of all races. The question is, how do we what lessons do we learn from these these two colliding trends here? How do we preserve our ability to participate in government decision making and do it in a way that allows us to advance the more just and equitable society we all want? What I'd like to do, if I could, is, as Angela and Dory mentioned, is have this, be as as open a discussion as we can. We encourage audience members, if they have questions, to raise their hands and participate, and raise those questions. I also want to mention before we get started that the views that panelists here represent tonight are their own views and not necessarily those of the institutions they work for. So with that long-winded introduction, for which I apologize, what I'd like to do, if I could, is start by asking Deborah Fisher of TCOG, spend a couple of minutes talking about what TCOG does, its role in all this, and what kinds of restrictions on public participation that you have seen here been implemented and enacted here in Tennessee over the past 6 months.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I thought I'd just walk you through. So TCOG, Tennessee Coalition for Open Government, has been around since 2003. And we do a lot of work on public records in open meetings. And our purpose is to preserve transparency in government. So probably 75% of what we usually deal with is public records, but open meetings have become kind of a big thing this year with COVID-19. And actually, I run a helpline, and most of the calls that I get from the public, as opposed to just journalists calling me, but just ordinary citizens calling me, are often about public meetings. So I'm just going to walk you through the timeline of what happened here in Tennessee. Similar things happened in other states. So when COVID-19 sort of came upon us, it was really kind of a very fast, even though it was slow coming, it was kind of a fast realization, I suppose, at the legislature. And so they actually shut down Cordell Hull building, which is where they have all their committee rooms. So all the public, members of the public, lobbyists, everybody who would go in, and that place was packed to go meet with lawmakers, talk to them about bills, were shut out. And there was actually a lot of people were pretty upset about that, because you basically then have email, which people may or may not read, and you may not be able to get through on the phone. People really relied at the legislature on talking to people in person, looking them face, eye to eye. So that was just sort of a precursor of what was going to be coming for meetings during COVID-19. And the legislature did try to pass a bill that would allow governing body members to basically have electronic meetings. But there were differences between the Senate and House version, and nothing got passed. But that also kind of shows you the tension there is, and the kind of unfamiliarity with widespread electronic meetings. Now, I'll talk about this later if I get a chance, but there is a statute that does allow electronic participation in meetings in certain limited instances for state boards, and then the only local governing board that has that provision are school boards, but it's very limited. You have to basically be out of the county, in the military, something like that, and it's you still have to have a physical quorum, and so there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through. Okay, legislature couldn't come to any kind of agreement about the scope, whether it should just be essential business this way or all kinds of business. So they left on the Thursday, and on a Friday, the governor stepped in with an executive order. Clearly, governing bodies needed to be able to continue to do their business. So he had, and we supported an executive order that would allow them to meet electronically. And it said to conduct essential business, which is something we wanted. that really was never actually defined. So we've sort of muddled through the next 2 months about what they were doing, and some have taken on, as you know, pretty big business. Nothing also was defined in the executive order about public comment periods, because that's actually not even in the Open Meetings Act. Public comment periods are not required in Tennessee law. There are certain places in the law where public hearings are required, as this group is probably familiar. And at the local level, it might be in the charter or in the rules that public comment periods are required. But public comment was not dealt with in the executive order. It was very fast. So all of this gets rolled out. We actually did a survey of electronic meetings that were held in April. And one of the questions we asked about a lot of things, audibility, that kind of thing. And we learned that, as we expected, that the capacity of governing bodies to effectively and efficiently conduct meetings electronically varied a great deal. Many of them were not at all set up to do this. They had never done it, broadcast or live stream their meetings. They struggled with the technology. I listened to one phone call where you hear the election commissioner saying, I can't hear. And, so there are just all kinds of problems with conducting business that way, much less making it effective for the public to either listen in or view. A lot of Zoom meetings are like this one, where you would see names of people on the call, but you really didn't see the people. So you really didn't see your elected representative there. And what's more, even if they allowed you to patch in and comment, they didn't see you. You didn't get to look them in the eye. You could chat something. What we found on public comment periods, which I think this group is interested in, was a really wide variety. People complained that they were able to email in comments. They weren't read into the record. So there were a lot of problems. But that's essentially what has happened. Jim mentioned that the governor's order will be allowed to expire. That kind of came through, not directly from the governor's office, but through the comptroller's office. And it does expire on June 30th. We do not think he's going to renew it in the same form. It may be that there is a different form, or maybe some kind of limited order that comes out. We're still waiting to see what that will be. But our understanding is that the governor is not interested in renewing it, and that the governing bodies can operate kind of like the House did when they came back, which was implement a lot of restrictions. If you come into the meeting, you have to get your temperature checked. You have to wear a mask. They may limit the number of people. So that's kind of where we are in terms of governing bodies. And I'll just leave it there and can come back. And I know Jim has a bunch of questions, so we'll circle back around. I can answer more about that, more about anything you guys want to talk about.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Appreciate that. Professor Hans, have you seen any adaptations worthy of note in the court system to the coronavirus? How widespread has that been?
There's been a lot. I teach at Vanderbilt, where I run a legal clinic focused on First Amendment issues. And amongst other things, we have trials or hearings in front of the Tennessee state courts and the U.S. federal courts. And we had a hearing in one of our cases that was done on Zoom, maybe sort of akin to what Deborah was referring to. There were some technical issues, but it all worked out. But some courts have stopped hearing cases. The criminal courts have their own special, constitutional requirements, as well as their own sort of modifications they've been making. But as we enter these reopening phases, you're starting to see some changes. So I think it's very, it varies based on the type of court. It varies if we're talking about state versus federal. There might also be administrative hearings. So there's just a whole kind of Wild West out there, which I think is, worrisome insofar as the confusion means that for those of us who are interested in court monitoring or court watching or keeping abreast of what's happening, there's just so many different variables to track, and it can become very overwhelming. Part of the challenge is when the onus comes on the citizen, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, that's not really fair given the resources that the state has versus the fact that citizens just definitionally have much less ability to monitor to the degree that they would need to in order to keep on top of things should they want to, stay abreast of what's happening in the court systems.
Yeah, appreciate that, Professor. And the First Amendment Clinic at Vanderbilt, its staple work over the past couple of years has been it's essentially been bringing litigation on the First Amendment arena, correct? And can you describe a little bit about the kinds of things that you've been involved in over the past couple of years?
Sure. So we've done a number of things, mostly litigation, as you mentioned, but some sort of policy work that can take the form of amicus work or legislative work or advocacy. But the bread and butter of the clinic does focus on civil litigation in the state and federal courts. So we've brought a suit against the Marshall County Jail. We're currently suing the state of Tennessee over an election law that criminalizes false speech. We've done some Public Records Act work as well. So we do a variety of different types of cases. We are always looking for new pro bono clients. We do work pro bono on behalf of organizations or individuals who lack financial resources. So if anyone on the call is interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to talk later about it. But that's sort of the model for the clinic. And Vanderbilt has a number of different clinics with different subject areas, but our focus is on the speech, press, and association components of the First Amendment.
Hey, Jim, there is a question that's come through chat that probably applies all across the board, which is we're all wrestling with all the different types of, we're seeing all these different dynamics from managing the pandemic, like city halls are, they may have people who can talk to the planning commission, but they're on a laptop in a whole nother room. So I guess, does any of us yet have sort of a sense of what might be the new normal? I might be jumping ahead, but I've got one here, like what's the equitable solution to balancing, people with lack of internet, but people who are vulnerable, they might not be, all these kind of things. Like, are we trying to go back to all in person, or does it depend on the venue? So I just there's been 3 or 4 chats like that.
Yeah, that's a perfect question. That's kind of the ultimate question.
Yeah, exactly. They want you to cut to the chase.
I'm glad that we have a group that is on top of things and cuts to the chase. So, Deborah or Agata, you want to take a whack at that now, or do you want to? Start off, we can get to delve into specifics as we go here. But
no, I think that's a great question, because one thing that we found in electronic meetings is that a lot of people in the public actually enjoyed being able, for the first time ever in some cases, to watch their local governing bodies, whether it be a school board or a county commission or whatever, live streamed. Or broadcast. So that in some ways opened up access, where people before didn't have a chance to go in person. And likewise, to the point in the question, if you were staying at home for your own safety and didn't want to get out in public, you could watch electronically safely. So from the public standpoint, there were a lot of people where you did broaden the access. So I think the question going back with the executive order being lifted, which is I think what's going to happen, is that will the governing bodies continue to provide, even if they're there in person, will they continue to provide electronic access? Will they continue to stream the meeting, record it on video, put it on YouTube? Most governing bodies in the state were not doing that before. Some were. And will they continue to do that? I think that they will be in a situation with physical meetings in which they're going to have to limit the number of people who can come into a room. They won't be able to pack to capacity the rooms that they are in now, because they will be, for the public safety, requiring people to be socially distanced or wear masks or all kinds of things. And they're probably within, I think that's probably quite lawful. So if they're going to do that, which they may need to do, they should be making some efforts to make it accessible electronically. And so my hope is that they do continue to do that. I know the same thing has been thought of in the courts, you know, broaden the access. I'm not sure. Right now, I think the one concern that's being pushed by some of the government associations is that we want some kind of exception for older people or people who are in high-risk groups who are members of governing bodies. Can they patch into the meeting electronically and participate and represent, you know, their constituency in the meeting, even if otherwise they aren't leaving their house, you know, for anything else. And so I think there's some concern and there may be some kind of accommodation worked out, but I don't know yet. I do think that really what happens next, I'm not sure. But I do think broadening access through electronic by, you know, letting people view it electronically would be helpful for public safety in that people don't have to all come to the meeting physically. And it would help public participation and understanding of what's going on, which is really the purpose.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you've got someone, Scott Banbury and some others bringing up, and some of us who work with trying to help folks understand how the process works and then attend a meeting. There's something that's lost when people aren't in those rooms. They're not in the legislature. They're not in planning commission meetings, county commission meetings. They don't see 400 people. When you're on a Zoom meeting, you can't tell who all's for or against an item and things like that. So I think that's one of the other dynamics is community organizing or representation that you can feel by having people present. So I think there's an interesting dynamic there. Now I'll stop talking. I'm trying to feed through some of the chat.
Can I speak to that really quickly?
Absolutely. Go for it.
All right. So I'm Scott Banbury. I'm with the Tennessee chapter of the Sierra Club. And when we're dealing with issues that are before the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation or local planning boards, oftentimes we don't know who the people are in a local community who are opposed to a project, for a project, whatnot. And it's only when we go to that public meeting that we're able to meet those people face to face, identify what their concerns are. Not everybody who's on this call is going to actually speak, and so we don't know what their opinions might be about things. But as I'm looking through the list right now, a lot of them, like, there's this guy, a PEDH2O, and I happen to know that that's Paul Davis, who used to run our Division of Water Quality in the state of Tennessee. But if I didn't know Paul already, I wouldn't recognize that username, and I wouldn't know who he was. I wouldn't know how to continue to have a relationship with him on these issues. And just today, Deborah Fisher was very helpful in this. We just had our Board of Adjustments in Shelby County decide to put onto a virtual meeting agenda a decision about putting a landfill in the floodplain of the Wolf River, one of our great rivers in Tennessee, but flows through Memphis. And they claim that they could do that under a part of Tennessee Code Annotated that Deborah Fisher pointed out only applies to state boards and to the city of Belmead. Deborah, is that right? But they're claiming that they have the ability to go forward with a virtual meeting. Now, a lot of the constituents that might be concerned about that, A, don't have access to the internet, and B, won't really know that they're supposed to be there. This is removing the ability of communities to actually work together to affect decisions that impact everybody. And so I'm all about having that additional ability to log in virtually, but we should not give up the personal meeting, face-to-face meeting.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, because I do a lot with journalists as well, and some journalists are like, hey, it's kind of cool, I can stay at home and cover this meeting. But the truth is that you got to be at the meeting. I was in journalism for 25 years. You have to be able to go up and ask for that document that they just talked about, to do a follow-up question with someone in person after, one of the representatives, the mayor, the commissioner, or whatever, and talk to people in the audience. So if a reporter is doing a story about something and they want to find out, well, who does this impact, then there's nothing better than being there physically and being able to go outside the door afterward and find that person who was just speaking to the county commission. You can't do that, very well, at least in electronic meeting. It's virtually impossible. I haven't seen it happen very well at all. So there is something about, a public meeting that puts you in the room with representatives who are doing government business. And yes, there is the part of the meeting where they're doing their business and you're not really involved in that. But there's the before and after the meeting, there is the public comment period. And all of that is important to participation and is part of, and I fear is going to not be remembered. That's like, hey, this was easy and convenient. How nice this is. Why do we have to have public meetings? But I think we're going to be answering that question in the next legislative session. I think that question's going to come up, and we're going to be having to make arguments about why in-person meetings are important. I feel quite certain about that.
Gautam, what are your thoughts on, is there a resolution here of this that protects the rights of both parties, both sides of the equation, governmental officials and the right to public participation?
Sure. This is a challenge that we're dealing with at the law school for very similar reasons, thinking about our student population, some of whom, just for various reasons, aren't going to be able to come in person. And of course, I think public health is the most important priority that one can think of, and certainly for the government, one of the most important priorities to protect. I have real concerns, and I saw some chat questions or comments about this, about the way that this exacerbates the existing digital divide, particularly on race and class dynamics, which is to say, going to what Deborah was referring to, that if there's this assumption that, oh, online is feasible now, we have proof of concept, now we can just do everything online, setting aside all the other, I think, very obvious concerns that we can think about with that kind of unexamined move, who are the citizens of the state who might be interested in monitoring, at least in the context of environmental regulation and oversight, whether or not people have the ability to actually do that, I think is a really open question. And those who have the least political power, the least economic power, the least access to information or time to engage are perhaps also less able to engage in an online only context as opposed to an in-person meeting where it might be more feasible for whatever reason. And so I think that's a real concern that I worry about getting ignored, as it too often is when it comes to law and policy making, and especially because we know already that poor communities and minority communities are less likely to have the kind of robust internet access that one might need in order to meaningfully participate. And even when you do have that access, it's still hard to participate. As anyone who has been living on Zoom for the last 3 months, like many of us have been, has seen that it's very easy it's not very easy to make this work, even in the best of situations. And I just worry about the fact that the trend has already been so bad for these communities, particularly when it comes to access to justice and environmental justice, that it could just easily become even worse.
Yeah. It does seem to exacerbate the issues that we see that plague environmental justice communities in particular. The issue seems to be that the system is set up to, in many cases, go through the motions of public participation, and in the usual case. Just to use the environmental permitting context, which definitely applies to locally unwanted land uses in environmental justice communities, for example. The applicant has the ability to meet with the governmental officials, whether it's TDEC or local planning body or what have you, as many times as often as necessary to go through the issues and to try to get its permit, it's whatever's decision it wants, permission to build a housing subdivision, for example, in an area, what have you, put in an industrial plant. Yet the public, doesn't hear about these issues until this entire process of dialogue and contact between the applicant and the governmental department has gone on sometimes for months or years. We certainly saw that in several regulatory contexts over the past couple of years. And the public is limited to typically a 30-day comment period. It has 30 days notice of a public hearing, and in the usual case, 10 days after the public hearing in order to file written comments. And that is not nearly enough time and is grossly unfair in the usual case. And here we have yet another example, another constriction of the ability of the public to participate through the lack of ability to have organizers and community members talk, to have the press be able to show that there might be hundreds of people who are concerned about an issue, and obviously have the press cover it. It's is much different to cover a series of talking heads than it is actually to go to a hearing and talk to people on the sides and get their viewpoints and how they're affected and so forth. So why don't we, is definitely we want to come back to and discuss these concerns in some more depth. I think it might be useful to talk a little bit about what the basic public rights are in these areas. Deborah or Gautam, can you explain briefly, what the Tennessee, the basic Tennessee Open Records Act, Open Meetings laws do? The federal government has a corresponding statute. Do all public meetings have to be open? Do all governmental meetings have to be open? For example, if Attorney General Barr wants to talk about Roger Stone's sentence or Michael Flynn's, do those kind of discussions have to be in public? Maybe you could tell us kind of what the parameters of that are.
So do you want me to take this, Gautam? Okay, all right. Well, so my specialty is the State Public Open Meetings Act, but I will tell you though, just same thing with the federal. It is governing bodies that are subject to the Open Meetings Act and also to the Federal Sunshine and Government Act. These have to be, they're not committees, they're not, government officials. It is governing bodies, so they're legislative in nature. So no, not everything is open. So in terms of the Open Meetings Act, though, government bodies in Tennessee are required to provide access to the public. There was an AG opinion in 1998 that basically went through the law. They were trying to determine whether they could limit cameras, basically video recording in an open meeting, and decided that the First Amendment doesn't protect access to a governing body meeting, but in Tennessee, the Tennessee Constitution does, and the Open Meetings Act does. So people do have a right, said the AG, and I think this is held up, to have access to a public meeting. That's why the governor had to suspend it and, included a reference to the Tennessee Constitution and, in his order. But they do have a right. That doesn't give them the right, however, as I mentioned earlier, to speak. And it also doesn't remove the right of the governing body to put in limitations or to have restrictions to protect the public safety of the meeting, or even the proceedings, the decorum of the meeting. So they can, do some things. They just can't do it, based on, I don't like you or I don't like your viewpoint. It has to be something that's, the same for everybody. But the public does have a right of access. And I think that in Tennessee, and I think that, there is some question about whether the electronic meetings have really fulfilled that during this period. But I believe we were in such an emergency situation that, I found that most people around the state were pretty patient with it, even if some things were a little questionable on how it got done. But there were complaints. And so it going back to in-person meetings, I think is better. It sort of recognizes that the information flow is different and important, but we still have coronavirus here. And so people still can't get out. And there will be situations like that. So broadening, I think the only answer is that governing bodies need to work hard to broaden access, but not limit, the public, totally ban the public from coming.
Adam, you have some thoughts on that? Does the press, for example, have a right to participate in go to a governmental meeting? What kind? How even-handed is the government required to be in these kinds of circumstances?
Under the First Amendment, the rights of access are unfortunately relatively limited, although Deborah talked about the state analogs, which I think are more robust. One of the things is to think about is that, in general, the government has, when it starts making access available to some, it really needs to make it available to all. And that might be potentially as a constitutional matter, but also as a matter of just policy or good government. And I think one of the things that we talk a lot about in the law is like, to what degree, government is actually required or constrained from doing certain things, and to what degree public policy or best practices or public pressure sort of have a soft requirement that might be more robust than what is strictly legally required. Another way to think about it is that the law can't solve everything, and sometimes you have to use other avenues or other tactics to get what you need, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware. And so, there are lots of good arguments to be made as to, what the core of good government is, and certainly we can debate the contours of that, but I think there are certainly core principles of access, accountability, notice, predictability, a lack of arbitrary and capricious decision-making. Someone mentioned meeting times. We don't want governmental bodies meeting at 3 a.m. for obvious reasons. So there's all sorts of things that might not be legally or constitutionally mandated, and yet we, can agree on as sort of core principles. And I think those can and should be flexible to some degree, and certainly a public health crisis is a good piece of evidence as to why flexibility is necessary. But, I tend to be sort of cynical about these things, and my read is that the government is always looking to sort of minimize the ability of the public to meaningfully participate for obvious reasons, because of the incentives of those who do participate to potentially obstruct or at least question what the government is doing. And so there's always going to be a push and pull between those two poles. And certainly this situation is one of them, where, under cover of crisis, you can see certain long-term goals that the government might have about limiting access come into light. I always think about, this is a very different situation, of course, and hopefully won't be offensive to anyone, but, after 9/11, the Patriot Act was enacted, but the provisions of the Patriot Act were written long before 9/11. Many of them were a wish list from the surveillance state of things that they might want to have happen. And, that horrible crisis allowed for some of those things to get enacted into law. And I just worry that a crisis like this could also provide an opportunity for government to limit meaningful access by all members of the community. as has been the trend, I think, for too long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And this, in the environmental context, we see the rules are are derivative essentially of the principles that you stated. There is under the Clean Water Act, there is an opportunity for a public hearing, and that doesn't mean there necessarily is a public hearing in every circumstance, but what that does mean is that for there to be a meaningful opportunity to participate, the government, the agency has to disclose essentially all of the facts and all of the methods on which it's going to rely to achieve the water quality standards, which are the goal of the the permitting process in the first place. And so it's it's one that if it's done properly, it is one that allows for meaningful participation. If it's not, then there are challenges, and there are challenges both for the for the public to participate, but also, quite frankly, challenges to the applicant or permittee, because the applicant or permittee might not have a permit that would stand up if challenged. So it's important for everybody to make sure that the opportunity for public participation is preserved. So I guess I would, we're running a little short of time here, but I'd like to open it up to questions before kind of throwing kind of the penultimate or maybe the ultimate question out here for discussion. As I listened to everybody's comments, including our panelists and Deborah and Gautam. I thank you very much for the great insights. It seems like our right to participate in governmental decision making is it's an important one, but we don't have an absolute right to participate, to have an in-person hearing, or to have press coverage. Since those rights are not absolute or guaranteed in every circumstance, what we is the moral of the story that we have to be prepared, as a public, when we pursue environmental equity concerns, that we have to be prepared to do and to bring to those same to those considerations the same kinds of techniques that we have seen exercised with the after the death of Mr. Floyd. We have to be willing to stand up and make sure that the governmental decision makers know that we have these concerns, and there's there's really no substitute essentially for the political solution here. Thoughts? Gautam, Deborah, members of the audience?
Anybody?
Yeah. Anybody?
Please unmute yourself if you're giving questions for the panelists.
Or just all of us, just.
Yeah, anyone.
I mean, the reality is this is not etched in stone. None of this is. And so I think that's what we're all getting a flavor for. Like we might be been used to a certain way of doing things and learned how to make it work well. So, and same thing with like the leadership, they're relying on hearing from their community leaders and community members. So it's helpful to understand from Debbie and from Gautam and others, like where the law is and what constitutional rights you may have, but there's a lot of wiggle room. And so there could be positives to some of this stuff, like Debbie's pointing out, hey, we can get all this stuff videotaped now much more easily and there's more access. But it's we're all gonna, I think a lot of people have to figure out a better way to be more engaged in decision making. It's been eroding anyway. So I think that's one of our biggest concerns is you can watch, but you don't have much influence.
So Dory, you just mentioned videotaping of hearings. We have not necessarily seen that in Tennessee. Like TDEC hearings have not been made available to the public after the fact.
I was thinking about, I'm talking about like, I'm also thinking about city, county, you know, a lot of those are recorded and bam, they go right up on the website. So some of that's been, you know, easier to get to, even though a lot of them already record. But who was it saying earlier? Maybe it was Deborah. A lot of these communities and towns and cities across Tennessee, they're rural. They don't have those kind of resources. But anyway, I didn't mean to, I'm not trying to advocate for one little, I think the reality is it's like, whoa, you know, there's a whole, everything got thrown up in the air. And I think I personally and professionally am concerned about, we're going to try and figure out where to land in 3 months. You know, I don't think it's something that's easy to figure out.
All right, I would say that it's important for people to understand what's important to them about meetings, because I do fully expect that there will be legislation filed next year in an effort to try to expand electronic meetings. But if that happens, I mean, there are a lot of things that we'd like. We'd like better notice. We'd like agendas that were more detailed. We'd like them on the website, easy to get to, board packets, you know. So it's almost like, you know, if we're going to go down the path of more electronic meetings or more participation electronically, let's do some things for the public too. We don't have to do everything for members of governing bodies who would rather patch into the meeting from their house. I mean, it has to be thought of from a public standpoint in terms of what is the goal here for better trust in government, better public participation, so that, you know, you don't always, you might not always, I don't always get my way at the legislature. They don't do everything, but if I have a chance to be heard, if I have a chance to testify, I at least feel like I'm able to share a viewpoint that gets considered in part of the deliberation. And that's what's important to people, that they get to, you know, share, especially I'm sure in the work that a lot of people are involved in here. So we need it so there's not, you know, we don't need things that take government farther away from the people that they're representing. And government meetings are something that actually is required. You all have to be there in the same place. So that's why this, you know, disruption has been strange for people. But I think, as Dory says, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in 3 months and 6 months with this virus. So anyway, but I think we're going to have to be able to define the values here that are most important, as well as how do you participate, which is the bottom line, effectively with your representatives when the ways you did that are no longer really available. So
Deborah, you just hit on something really important to me. As a lobbyist in Nashville, if I'm not actually there in the building, I don't get to see an amendment that's coming to a caption bill that has not been disclosed to the public at all, unless I'm actually in the building and can go by somebody's office and get a copy of it, or in the committee room get a copy of it. And so if we're going to have virtual meetings, there has got to be disclosure. There's got to be a sharing of the documents 2, 3, 4 a week in advance, you know, if democracy is really going to work. But right now, the system's kind of broken. We don't know what is coming up in a committee unless you're actually there to physically touch it. The budget is the biggest issue. You don't get to see what's in the budget in the Tennessee General Assembly unless you're in the committee room that morning when they have a big stack of the budgets, you know, piled up on the desk, and everybody rushes up there to grab a copy to see what has happened. It's not made available to the public before that.
No, you're right. Access to documents, and also just being there. I know, speaking of being there, you know, you're there as kind of a citizen lobbyist, you know, and I'm there advocating. And if there's a bill that's affecting open meetings or public records, you know where I sit? Front row. I want people to see me. So they may not want to go for it, but they at least know I'm watching, you know, and you know, I just think, but your point to the information flow, that's what I was trying to say earlier, access to, like you're talking about the amendments in the legislature, but I think there's that kind of information flow that happens in person at other types of governing body meetings too. It certainly happens at the legislature. You're right. If you're not there, you know, you're not going to be able to get the information you need.
I've been on a bunch of city council meetings. where even city council people were saying, wait, can I see what our actual, you know, statute is, the ordinance that we're voting on? And it's not even available to the people that are on the city councils, let alone available to the public, or maybe more importantly, the media, so that the media can put it out to the public what's being decided by their elected bodies in the absence of knowledge.
The caption bill in particular is one that seems to be specifically designed to squelch and truncate public participation to the maximum degree possible. It's a horrific abuse.
And so I think this is Dory chiming in, looking at some of the chat. Obviously some people are hearing is these are folks who are doing this, are sort of your representatives on environmental issues or governance in the state legislature. Others of us, and you all, I know some of you all I know well, have been working on issues and you're interacting with city government and county commissions and all that. One of the fundamental things is getting this information out much sooner so that everyone has access to it. And so there's some common themes that we're all chatting about and talking about that are almost irregardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not. Is there anything, and it's at 7 o'clock right now, I thought I would just do a quick echo and say thank you all very much. We don't have to end it right now, but if our speakers need to roll or some of y'all need to do, I just want to say thank you. And obviously to keep up with what we're talking about and send us topics so we can, or say, hey, I really think this is a great person. We've had people here from other parts of the country as well, because some of these issues cut across all over, and maybe Arkansas's got a better idea, or Kentucky, or some other states. So we're not all kind of in our own little bubbles, and Tennessee's got great things to offer. Just send them our way. Please go to harpethconservancy.org and sign up. That way your email's in our system so you can get information. You don't have to log out right this minute if you don't want to, but I just wanted to make sure folks felt comfortable leaving if they wanted to. And thank you again to Gautam and to Deborah and to Jim, and we can keep rolling if you'd like. So I just wanted to do our little wrap up plug.
All right, thank you very much, Dory. And Gautam, if you're still on, you have any thoughts on what the ultimate solution here is? Is there what's the best way to preserve public access?
You're asking me to solve the problem of democratic accountability in a soundbite?
What's your elevator speech on these
Yes.
issues? I apologize for putting you on the spot.
No, totally. No, it's fine. I mean, law professors love to think big and then talk endlessly about it. So I think that it's not that, sadly, it's not that hard, and yet that might be why it's so difficult to achieve, which is to say that I think all the topics that people have been talking about, access, notice, accountability, opportunity, equity, these are very baseline principles that would be, I think pretty straightforward to instantiate in law. And yet, it goes to what I was saying before about my cynicism. And I should say that, especially because as someone who works on speech and surveillance and privacy, it's very easy to become one of these tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. And I try to avoid going that far. But what I mean to say is not that I think that there's some sort of government conspiracy to keep people out. Frankly, I don't think that any of us have that much confidence in the ability of any government to do that very effectively, at least in this country. I think it's more just, entropy and just slowness and confusion and lack of coordination and lack of resources and buy-in. To create the situation where people feel like they're not being heard. And so I think the baseline good government proposals that have been made by many organizations, both subject-specific organizations like you all, but also people who work on sort of, what Deborah works on in terms of more baseline democratic accountability, I think those proposals are there. It's just a question of how much public pressure can really be used to force the issue. I think I will say one thing now, which has been good to see, is that after a lot of talk of the public apathy around a lot of issues that people thought were intractable or potentially unsolvable, I think this moment, particularly for those of us who are active in racial justice and criminal justice, it feels a little different. I don't want to be so optimistic as to say that it is different, but it certainly feels a little different. And perhaps that means that some of that energy can be used in a lot of different venues where I think we could potentially see some change. So that's like my 5% optimism to, sweeten the bitter coffee of 95% cynicism. But that's sort of my, I think, baseline approach to these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, thank you. I think there are a number of other people out there who want to jump in with questions, and as long as our panelists are willing to stay on, I'm certainly willing to do so. Kathleen Dennis, I saw you try to pop on here a couple of different times. Anybody else?
I'm on here. I'm just listening, but actively, shaking my head in agreement when I feel like I'm in agreement. So, no, this is great because I think it's an important issue right now. Specifically I think social justice goes hand in hand with environmental conservation. I just do. And I really like that you brought both Gautam, who I've never met, of course, and Deborah onto this panel. I think this is excellent.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your support.
But actually, Gautam was pointing out something that is important that gets back to the budget too, which is in general, unfortunately, as much as some, I sort of one of those, but government grows. That's what government tends to do. But, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, most of those staff and the Tennessee Department of Conservation almost always will have a public hearing if you ask for one. So even if it may not be something they have to do, they usually do it. And so find a bigger meeting room. Like someone was asking earlier, can we have some of these meetings in bigger places where you can do some of the social distancing? The State Environmental Agency has some flexibility because they try and find locations in the community. But what about a city hall? Where do you start moving these to a gymnasium? But some of it gets back to money too. Some of these rural communities need some frickin' money to invest in some of these technology tools, as well as you were just mentioning, Gautam, it's like having some of those resources, which can be generic, but some of it is money towards having more effective public involvement. And there might be specifics as to what that means, but it's frustrating when I work in some very small communities. The building's only so big, so we need to be more flexible. We need to sort of almost as a community help our city and local governments actually morph.
Madeline had a question. Do you want to about multiple meetings in different regions or locations across the state? She wants to know if you can have multiple meetings across the state at the same time, smaller but more meetings.
So the state of Tennessee already does that in regards to rulemaking for the Department of Environment and Conservation. And so we'll have opportunities for people to go to their local office of TDEC and participate in a broader meeting that's happening statewide virtually. And that's something that we'd already been doing before this pandemic, and something that hopefully we will continue to do. One of the limitations there is that you actually have to go to that local TDEC office. Mm-hmm. Why in those cases can't we use a forum like this where people don't actually have to go to their local TDEC office, but they could actually log in online and participate? And
that's
right.
So again, all the stuff we're getting at is some of these blends, but I think there's some fundamental, it depends on the leadership in each city to some extent, leadership in the legislature, leadership in the agencies as to how much public involvement.
Yeah.
Well, and the willingness to try new things.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I was pleased to see today I ran across where TDEC is trying to incorporate both the idea of a larger in-person venue as well as allowing electronic participation as a supplement to the in-person meetings. So that's good. So that's a trend that, assuming one or two public notices make a trend, that's a trend that ought to be encouraged. So.
Hey Jim, look, I'm going to be mean and I'm going to call out Brooke Barrett because I see she's on the call. Brooke, do you want to tell us anything about that?
No, I'm actually glad you did. I was just about to unmute myself. Because I'm like, now they're talking about exactly what I've been talking about all day today. And that is that we definitely do want to continue to try and offer the online as an option, but primarily it's going to be a hybrid, like what you guys have been kind of discussing, is that online will be incorporated, but I think that, you know, having an in-person availability needs to be, we're going to start to bring that back, obviously. So how that's going to work and, you know, the logistics of it will probably still need to be worked out. But I personally think that having an online option will allow for more participation for people in the future. The more options that we can offer people to participate, the better, because we would really like for people, you know, as many voices as we could have at the table. That's how we're going to make our best decisions.
And for those who don't know, Brooks with TDEC, just in case.
Yes, sorry.
There are
I'm
some
with
folks from the states on here.
I'm with External Affairs for TDEC, Department of Environment and Conservation, and coordinate most of our department's public participation.
And I've been seeing some chat too from folks from other states. I think Cindy had to drop off. And it was very interesting to, as you can tell, and Deborah mentioned it already, we've got some different dynamics in each state. But I think we're all going to need to realize that no matter what your specific issue is, we're going to need to be focusing on this at a broader context. The legislature is going to be wrestling with this, right, Deborah? And so it's going to behoove all of us to sort of reach out and discuss this with all kinds of different different entities are interested in different types of issues, but all need access to government in order to debate and discuss and get their stuff changed, right? Or to get their ideas in motion. The environmental organizations are not going to be able to do this on their own, just like someone working on another different type of social justice issue. We're going to need a much more organized debate and discussion and coordination. Deborah and Gautam, do you have some other players that have been interested in these kinds of things that are not environmental at all?
Well, interestingly, we partnered with some other groups when we were looking at the open courts issue, and with groups that we really haven't worked with before on open meetings of governing bodies. But these were people who were, you know, court watch programs and so forth that, you know, monitor proceedings in courts. And that was sort of a whole different kind of group. But Dory, actually, I think we do need to widen the conversation because sometimes the people who are involved in these things are of a certain socioeconomic, you know, group. And so you come at it with these particular viewpoints. And that's actually been something that's been on our kind of list of, you know, I know everybody's talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that is one of our, we've wanted to broaden the conversation on that so that we aren't just thinking, you know, through one lens. Exactly. But other groups that are interested in this have traditionally been, in terms of good government, it really does, all these things are good government issues. They're not just open government issues, you know, adequate notice, people being able to know the amendment that they're voting on, you know, things like that are good. As Brooke mentioned, you know, getting adequate feedback from the public, probably from a variety of voices, is of interest to them. So there are a lot of groups that are interested in that, besides sort of the general League of Women Voters, but, you know, the Beacon Center has been interested in it, and pretty much, you know, any entity that a lot of entities sometimes have different viewpoints about a particular issue, but they tend to all want a fair chance. They all, you know, so it can be a unifying issue to try for good government reforms, but a lot of times not top of mind for each entity, you know. So that is why we sort of, that's all we do, and we do try to bring people into the coalition. So if you're interested in us, you can sign up for our email newsletter on our website. I'll type in our web address, and just to keep everybody informed.
Absolutely. And
The only
just,
thing I would
go.
add to that is that one way to think about it is to think backwards from the different kinds of governmental bodies that might be at issue here, and then think about what groups are interested in those. So some obvious ones besides environmental, schools, criminal court, housing court, unemployment insurance, like basically any kind of setting, for anyone who's a lawyer who thinks about like administrative agencies or public agencies, like what are those different agencies that we think about having like relatively frequent public meetings or, some kind of like public venue, whether it's in the judicial system or in the administrative system, and then thinking backwards. And I think Deborah's totally right to focus that, it doesn't have to be people who are on the same side of an issue necessarily, because everyone has an interest in engaging. But I think the other thing that she pointed out, I really think is exactly right, which is that, again, thinking about lawyers, like we tend to divide things between process and substance, like procedural justice versus substantive justice. And many of us who work on these things focus on the substantive justice and what are we trying to do in front of an environmental agency? What are we trying to do in housing court? What are we trying to do in the criminal court? And that's of course very important. And then the procedural rules just necessarily take a back seat sometimes because we're so overwhelmed with the substantive changes we want to make. Here, I think we're talking a lot about procedural changes, procedural requirements, and that is where you don't even need to necessarily have substantive alignment with everyone, but most people will tend to be on board with the procedural things that oftentimes get overshadowed by concerns that might be more imminent.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep.
Other questions, comments from audience members? Deborah or Gautam, anything that we should have covered that we didn't?
No, I just want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to opine at length, which all professors love to do. But it's great to see so many people really interested in these core issues, and particularly to see how different groups think about them, because I think it's just vital to realize that there are lots of allies that we might not have anticipated who are concerned with the same things that we are.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, thank you very much, Gautam and Deborah. Really appreciate your willingness to participate. It's a very important topic, and I think you made a great contribution to the effort. So, thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for participating. Truly, there's been some really interesting points. One of the reasons why we wanted to even have this discussion is to kind of get past it, as Gautam's saying, is issues and focus on process, because ultimately, we need transparency. We need good government for everything we're trying to work on. And different things are happening in different, different spheres. And so there might be good things happening, maybe criminal court, that we could maybe borrow and put someplace else, or, we just don't know, because we're not in this, we're not sharing that information across these worlds. And now's the freaking time is what I'm feeling. It's like, this is the time to get at some of these issues that usually kind of, I'd love to deal with this. I think it's affecting everybody. And thank you all very much.
Well, thanks, Dory.
Appreciate
Thanks for having me and let me talk about public records. I haven't seen you in person for a while, so we have a little history, I think, that going back on issues. It was good. It was good. But thanks for letting me.
And thank you, Angela. Thank you, Ryan, and everybody else. And thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Gautam, truly. And that's a great idea, Gautam. You're right. Go for all the different commissions and who's working the commissions, and we'll find our various groups to interact with. So maybe that's our next step. We'll reach out to you guys and some others and go, okay, let's go find 2 or 3 groups we think are working well in those areas, and let's have a discussion. If we were to come up with some suggestions, then we can sort of be driving the discussion as opposed to reacting to bills and things like that. Thank you guys so very much.